The Rear Admiral Raymond F. Dubois Fellowship in International Affairs offers Taft students the opportunity to learn more about international affairs through annual presentations by guest lecturers. Nancy Lindborg has served since February 2015 as President of the United States Institute of Peace. She has spent most of her career working in fragile and conflict-affected regions around the world. Prior to joining the Institute of Peace, she served as the Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance at USAID. From 2010 through early 2015, Ms. Lindborg led USAID teams focused on building resilience and democracy, managing and mitigating conflict, and providing urgent humanitarian assistance. Ms. Lindborg led DCHA teams in response to the ongoing Syria crisis, the droughts in Africa, the Arab Spring, the Ebola response, and numerous other global crises. She has lived and worked in Nepal and Kazakhstan, spending a total of 30 years working on issues of peace, conflict, and development. She holds a BA and MA in English Literature from Stanford University and an MA in Public Administration from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Please welcome Ms. Nancy Lindborg.
Thank you, Veronica, and good morning, everybody. It is really a wonderful opportunity to be with everybody here on your Thursday morning communal gatherings. And I have to say, I can't see a thing with the lights, but I know you're there, and it's great to have you here. As Veronica said, I'm the president of the United States Institute of Peace. And so today I want to talk to you a little bit about what is USIP, what do we do, and why does that work matter, and how does it matter for you? And I want to start, and I'm going to try to get beyond the lights here, and a show of hands, how many of you have ever heard of the United States Institute of Peace? So not very many of you. Okay, we're going to change that. So the U.S. Institute of Peace was, oh, thank you. Can you still see? That's great, that's great. So the U.S. Institute of Peace was founded about 34 years ago by the U.S. Congress. And they were eager to have a non-partisan, independent federal institute that was devoted to how do we better prevent and resolve violent conflict. And USIP was established as a result of a lot of work by people both inside and outside of the government. And there were a group of leaders within Congress who had come back from World War II and from the Korean War, seized by the fact that we needed as a country more capacity and greater focus on how do we wage peace as well as we wage war. And they noted that there were many military academies and there needed to be an academy for peace as well. So it was initially conceived of as a National Peace Academy in the 1960s by congressional leaders. At the same time, there was a grassroots movement that said, we need a similar greater focus on peace within the country. And the two met, the grassroots movements and the congressional leadership, in 1979 created a commission which traveled around the country talking to people about this issue. And it resulted in legislation that formed the Institute and was signed into law by President Reagan in 1984. And you see here two senators, one from Oregon, Hatfield, and one from Hawaii, Matsunaga, at the foundation of USIP. And I tell you a little bit of that history because to me it's a very powerful way of illustrating how what each of us does as a citizen of this country has the opportunity to create change and to redirect what we think about and focus on as a country. As we go forward, it's useful also to realize that this is deeply rooted in our country's history. We're here on the Mall. Has anyone been to Washington, D.C. and seen this big building and wondered what goes on there? So that's what we're talking about. We're right on the Mall across from the Lincoln Memorial with the Washington Memorial in sight. And my window looks at the Lincoln Memorial, which is a powerful reminder each and every day of what happens when disagreements cannot be managed and they turn into violent conflict. And we saw what happened with the Civil War. As early as George Washington, we had leaders who were thinking about the importance of peace. And in fact, when George Washington retired, he went back to Mount Vernon and started thinking about the very paramount importance of having a policy that really focused on peace. And in fact, he put a weather vane at the top of Mount Vernon in the shape of a dove that we now have on our weather vane at USIP. So we connect back to our history as well. So how many of you read the paper or listen to the radio or see the TV news every day and have a sense that there's more conflict today, I'm seeing hands, that there's more conflict today than you remember? I mean, it seems as if we are really engulfed in conflict right now. And I raise that because, and I'm going to come back to that a little bit later, but it is more important than ever that we think about how do we address violent conflicts from Syria to what's going on with the 4 famines that we have going in the world right now, to the 65 million people who are displaced globally, all of whom are displaced by conflict, to the 4 civil wars, to the rising great power competition. This is a time when all of us need to be very mindful of what is happening and what is our role, both as individuals and as part of our greater country. And I want to just note, these are pictures of me in various places, and I want to say that I've spent most of my career on the downside of conflict, after violent conflict has broken out, after people are in a terrible situation where they need urgent humanitarian assistance, whether from violent conflict or natural disasters. And we know that when natural disaster hits in countries that are ill prepared, people suffer even more. And you don't do this for very long without realizing that humanitarian assistance is urgent, it's wonderful, it's life-saving, but it's a Band-Aid. And we collectively need to understand, how do you get ahead of the conflict? How do we get to a place where we're able to make a difference so that the conflict doesn't turn violent, doesn't turn into a terrible war or a huge outflow of refugees? How do we do a better job of that, or of stopping what appear to be endless spin cycles of conflict? And that's what led me to U.S. Institute of Peace. U.S. Institute of Peace is working around the globe with very practical solutions. So I want to just tell you a little bit about what we do and how we do it. And the first is that we have 3 fundamental strategies. The first is that we work locally. We have teams working with partners around the world, helping to equip individuals, communities, governments with the kind of research and very practical tools for what are the ways to manage conflict and resolve conflict. And we operate on the fundamental assumption that conflict will always exist. There will always be disagreements between people. People will have differing ideas. People may feel left out for whatever reason. The importance is what you do when conflict happens. Conflict, in fact, can be transformative. We've seen in our own country the enormous social upheavals from the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement. These movements have all fundamentally changed who we are as a people, how we understand ourselves. And the importance is that they were transformative, and they didn't lead to a civil war. They didn't lead to the kind of violence that can rip a country, a community, and a family apart, which we see in so many other parts of the world. So how do you manage conflict so that it's transformative and not violent? So you work locally because, first of all, whatever happens at the governmental level from a top down cannot be effective if you're not also working from the community level up. And every community, every subnational part of a country has their own grievances, their own issues, and you need to work with individuals so they are equipped with the tools to manage conflict and connect up with what's ever happening at the national level. And that's where real change occurs. Secondly, you need to promote inclusivity. This is core. This is the core to managing conflict. When people feel excluded, when people feel marginalized, that's when they lash out. That's how revolutions start. This is the fundamental of whether you are running a government or running any kind of movement, is the importance of being more inclusive. When voices are heard, when people have an opportunity to be a part of the conversation, a part of their own future, you are much more likely to have a peaceful resolution to the inevitable disagreements. And thirdly, we train people with very practical tools. So let's distill it down. We're talking really about having the ability to create bridges across divides, to create opportunities for dialogue, for mediation, for facilitation, for all the ways that we talk with each other instead of resorting to violence. We also have very specific skills around the strategies, for example, of nonviolent action. Right now in Iran, we're seeing these enormous street protests that are going on. These have the opportunity to create lasting change. What we know through the research that we do at USIP is that when those kinds of protests turn violent, you end up losing the opportunity to make lasting change. That nonviolent action, in the far greater percentage of cases, leads to permanent, lasting, peaceful change, whereas violent change often leads to yet another disruption, another cycle of violence. And to remain violent, you really do need some training and some tools, strategies to keep the protests inclusive. Otherwise, you'll lose the opportunity to create a mass protest, and you will lose particularly women, older people, and there's a greater chance that it will turn violent. Strategies like working not just on the street, but off the street. So there are, in each of these toolkits, there are skills and there are strategies, and part of what USIP does, both online and in classroom and with partners in hot zones around the world, is work on strategies, principles, and tools. So let me share with you a couple of stories of what that specifically looks like. In Iraq, USIP has worked in Iraq continuously with people on the ground since 2005. And one of the things that we've done is train a whole cadre of Iraqi facilitators, people who are deeply skilled in how to create dialogue and how to facilitate between disagreement, between people who are disagreeing. If you remember when ISIS started sweeping through Iraq, they came into a town called Tikrit, where there was a barracks filled with young cadets of the Iraqi army. Now, because the Iraqi army was not an inclusive organization, all of those cadets were Shia, as opposed to Sunni. So when ISIS came in, they killed every one of those cadets. They slaughtered 1,400 cadets in a day and took over the town of Tikrit. About 2 months, 2 years later, ISIS was swept out by the Iraqi and coalition militaries. And all of remember ISIS is Sunni, so all of the Sunni families who had stayed were terrified that there would be retribution, that they would be held responsible for what ISIS did. So they fled the city. And now you had a situation of massive displacement, increased animosity between the Shias and the Sunnis in this particular region. So working with our Iraqi facilitators, USIP and the Iraqi facilitators organized a series of facilitated dialogues between the Shia and Sunni leaders. And over the course of about 6 months, they sat down and they came to an agreement that it was not in their interest to continue this violence. And they came up with a peace accord that ultimately allowed 360,000 people to return to Tikrit. And today Tikrit is peaceful, the markets are back up and running, people are in schools, and the agreement is holding between those local leaders. We have done the same thing in about 8 cities and provinces around Iraq. Iraq is not a peaceful place at the national level, especially with elections coming up. They have a lot of conflict, a lot of potential tension. ISIS has been swept away, but it is not yet a peaceful place. But at the local level, where people are seeing it as their interest to find a peaceful way forward, the peace is holding. And it shows the power of sitting down together and talking about sometimes very deep, very difficult divides and bridging those. The second story I want to tell is about the work that we do with youth leaders. And given that we are right now at a global population of people between the ages of 10 to 24, which is now over 1.8 billion people, an enormous, that's all of you, but it's a lot of people in places that are filled with conflict. It is imperative that the next generation have the skills, have the tools to be able to manage conflict in the years ahead. So the young man here, so USIP works with youth leaders from conflict-affected countries so that we can support the efforts that they're undertaking to build peace in their own communities. So we took a group of young leaders to meet with the Dalai Lama in November. It's the second year in a row that we've done that. And these are really remarkable young people. This is Mahmoud Khalil here. He was getting ready to go to university in Aleppo in Syria when he was 18 years old. As he was heading to Aleppo, the civil war really heated up, and he was not able to even get into Aleppo. He came from Damascus. He ended up crossing the border into Lebanon, and suddenly he was a refugee at 18. You know, he was ready to go to college. Suddenly he's a refugee. And he was separated from his family. He was in a refuge. They don't have camps, but he was in a community where many of the refugees were living. He was trying to find work as a day laborer. But he didn't give up. He kept looking both for opportunities to keep himself fed and housed, but also how to make a difference in the larger community of refugees. And as the years went by, he attracted support. He was able to convince others to help him. He ended up getting a scholarship to go to the American University in Beirut, and 5 years later, at the time that he joined us a few months ago in Dharamsala, he is also helping to educate more than 4,000 young Syrian children. He's organized an NGO that provides education for others who are also refugees. He is a remarkable young man who has said, I'm in a terrible situation, but I have the power to make a difference, and I will make a difference. And he is an extraordinarily inspiring young man. Fatima Eskita, on the other side, is a 26-year-old young woman from the state of Borno in Nigeria. Does anybody know what Borno, Nigeria is famous for? This is the, what? Yep, this is the epicenter of Boko Haram, and this is the epicenter of all the young girls who were kidnapped by the terrorist group Boko Haram. That's where Fatima lives. And what Fatima did was realize that there needed to be additional assistance for those who either escaped or were rescued from Boko Haram. Because remember, Boko Haram was going up and kidnapping all kinds of young people. And the problem was when they came home, they were still rejected by their communities and even by their families. And so Fatima put together an organization that provided assistance for those people who returned to Maiduguri, her home city, so that they could reintegrate, so that they could have a pathway forward. And she's now running an organization that has 20 other people. This is something she founded when she was about 22 years old. She is making a remarkable difference in the world. Each one of these people has an extraordinary story. And I wanted to particularly share this with you because I know all of you are in high school, some of you are getting ready to go off to college. You have the power to make an enormous difference, not just among in your own life and the lives of your friends around you, but in your communities and as you go forward in your lives in the world around you. these young leaders are not waiting for someone else to make a change. They're making a positive change and the change that they want to see in their world. And part of USIP's work is to help support these kinds of young people with the kind of very practical skills that help them make a difference. So I want to just go back to this sense that the world is deeply on fire. And what you see with this graph here is the top blue line is armed conflict. The red line is wars. And these both relate to wars and conflicts that are within countries, like the civil war in Syria, like the civil war in Yemen. The bottom line is conflict between states. And you see that that's almost flatlined. And what I want to point out, I don't know if this pointer works, but you see that the peak is about in the 1990s, and then there's a steep decline. You see enormous progress, enormous reduction of violence and of armed conflict. But then in the circle, you see over the last 6 years, there's an uptick. So there is an uptick, and I think what this tells us is that we can never assume that progress is permanent. We have to continue to be vigilant about all the ways that we make progress, that we preserve our gains, and that we ensure that we don't lose precious peace. And I want to remind you that peace is indeed possible. These kinds of conflicts do get resolved. And I just show here on the map 3 conflicts. Northern Ireland and USIP helps support some of those talks. 30 years of conflict, 3,500 people were killed in that conflict has been resolved. It's peace as of 2 decades ago. In Liberia, that was an 18-year-old civil war. They just had an election last month, a peaceful election for the second time in which a new president has taken hold. And in Colombia, where just last year a peace accord ended 50 years of civil war. So fundamentally, the work of peace building is about partnerships, it's about practical applications, and as you see here, it's about time. It takes time. So we shouldn't feel discouraged. We should be renewed in our commitment that we need to get ahead of these crises and make a difference before things turn violent and need decades to resolve. So what can you do? At USIP, we work not just around the world, but we also work here in the United States to provide online resources. We have programs for students and teachers, a peace teacher group that we work with from teachers across the country. And one thing I really want to underscore for you is September 21st is the International Day of Peace. And working with a number of partners, we support something called the Peace Day Challenge. And this is an opportunity for people around the world to take a day to very mindfully commit themselves to the importance of building peace locally and internationally. And in 2017, the Peace Day Challenge reached 56 million people in more than 150 countries on social media and inspired activities in communities around the world in 22 countries and 41 states in the United States. So I hope all of you will join us next year in the Peace Day Challenge. And we know that there are many, many ways that you can stay engaged globally and in your own communities. And I would just note, don't forget to be in touch with your own members of Congress. And as somebody who lives in Washington, I can tell you that your voices matter. You have 2 very active on these issues senators here in this state, although I know many of you are from around the country and around the world. But for those of you who are from the United States, it really makes a difference that they hear your voice. So I look forward to the conversation. I would just end by saying peace is a very practical enterprise. It's practical, it's possible, and it's essential for our security. And it's working together that we make that possible. So thank you very much, and we'll take questions from here. Is that how that works?
I'm wondering how many people would think they're going to donate back in the I guess we'll have room for people in the back room. So when we're done here, we'll go to the back room question.
Okay.
Well, while they're here, though, I'm wondering, is there any summer internships that students could in Washington or anything?
You know, there's lots of, we don't have high school internships at U.S. Institute of Peace, but there are lots of internships in many, many organizations who are working in different ways on these critical issues. And I urge all of you to take a look at that, as well as around the world. And there are good resources online for that.
Do you want to show that video?
Yes, please.
One thing left, one short.
A quick 3-minute video, it's a further conversation with some of the youth leaders who were with us in Dharamsala that you might find interesting. Can you, yeah.
So I got nominated and I read the word Dalai Lama and everything. I was like, okay, this is a junk mail. Let's just ignore it.
This program is different from any I've ever seen. An extraordinary moment where 28 youth leaders from conflict zones around the world came together to be mentored by the Dalai Lama in how change happens.
I want to learn how to forgive and I want to learn how to love.
So I was shaking for about 15 minutes or maybe more, and when His Holiness walked in, it was just a great moment.
When His Holiness entered the hall, I just feel like a dream.
Be optimistic. So no matter how difficult it is, you see, we should be more optimistic sort of attitude.
Here were a bunch of young people who had experienced deep tragedy and lived in regions of conflict, and they chose to use that energy, that conflict, that fear for their own life, and turn it into something incredibly constructive.
In Tunisia, we are facing an identity crisis, and young people are not hopeful anymore.
Actually, violence is signs of weakness. Forgiveness is signs of strength.
How can we utilize this good friendship or trust between people and religious leaders like you to bring peace between the tribes in my country?
Now should be active in the well-being of the society.
I feel empowered that the Dalai Lama is really interested in youth.
What he said was how encouraged he was by meeting with these young people.
Not only His Holiness, but also the participants from this program, they all inspire me. They risk their life for their peace-building works.
After meeting His Holiness, this guy gave a kind of energy that it's us who should build our country. It's us who should make the changes from inside.
What you have here is a group of determined, passionate, committed, action-oriented leaders who are building peace, who have been deeply inspired by our 2 days.
I really got a lot of sort of a source of encouragement. So very, very encouraging.
Now I feel like my soul and my spirit is enriched.
He put so much confidence in us that yes, our voice, our actions can make a difference. He believed in our abilities to make significant changes in our communities.
Now that I met the Dalai Lama, I am going to share the compassion he has shared with us, the love he has shared with us in my community.